Some more about Luther. In December, that is in 1517, the Bishop of Mainz complained about Luther to Rome, and he was called to the Archbishop Cajetan in Augsburg in 1518. By this time, others had got involved. Others at Wittenberg were convinced by Luther, and so he went to Augsburg with others with him. Luther and Cajetan talked not only about indulgences, but also about the sacrament of Holy Communion, and fell out. Cajetan sent Luther away until he would recant. Luther wrote directly to Rome to defend his position, and he also wrote to his prince, Prince Frederick, who was in a politically important position at the time. Cajetan also wrote to Frederick. Frederick had to decide between the two. Who would he back? 1519, a public disputation was arranged in Leipzig between Luther and his colleague Karlstadt and an opponent called Eck. Eck, on the surface, it won the day, but not all the minds of those who had heard. And Luther, feeling squashed by papal authority, and yet convinced that what he said was what the Bible said, felt the conflict between the Pope and the Bible. He felt the Bible should have preeminence in this conflict, and so stood firm against those who wished to stop his arguments. 1520, Luther's arguments were denounced and burnt in Rome. But in many German cities, Luther was finding a hearing. Luther wrote an important tract addressed to the rulers of Germany, the princes, knights, cities, under the young emperor, this is the Holy Roman Emperor still, Charles V. It appealed to the secular rulers to call a council to resolve the issue in the church. Remember, that is what happened in the earlier church, and not just to side with Rome. In 1521, the Pope issued a bull, which is a formal proclamation by the Pope, excommunicating Luther. It was tossed in the river. Later that year, Luther was called to an imperial diet, a council in Worms. Luther's prince, Frederick the Wise, had persuaded the Holy Roman Emperor that Luther should not be condemned without being able to argue his case. The church politicians were enraged. The Pope's decision surely was enough. The secular rulers were merely to enforce it. April the 17th, 1521, Luther appeared before the emperor and an array of bishops. Charles V, who was only 19 years old at the time, was cold towards Luther and said, "It is preposterous that a single monk should be right in his opinion, and that the whole of Christianity should be in error 1,000 years or more," and immediately asked him to recant. Luther asked for time, and so 2 days later he returned with a prepared speech. In it, he argued that he would apologize for the violence of his polemic, but not for the content. He would only recant if they could show from Scripture where he was wrong. If they could not, he would be bound by his conscience. This idea is summed up in the apocryphal phrase, "Here I stand, I can do no other." He probably never said it, but it really sums up what he was like. Now, Luther was supported by many of the knights present, so the emperor did not dare to harm him, so he dismissed him. But after most of the diet had dispersed, an edict was issued which outlawed Luther and forbade his writings. 1526, he was taken to Wartburg Castle for his own safety, and there he translated the New Testament into German so it could be read by all. In 1522, he returned to Wittenberg to try and calm down the more radical reformers. In 1526, the Edict of Worms was rescinded, but in 1529, another diet tried to resist further advance. At that council, a row of German princes resisted what they saw as unacceptable legislation. They stood up and protested. And so we have the term Protestants. In 1530, at the Diets of Augsburg, the Protestants submitted their statement of belief, and the Roman Catholics refused to accept it. Over the next years, Luther articulated his theology more clearly and was joined by others. An important part of what he taught involved Holy Communion. Unlike the Roman Catholics, as we must now call them, he did not agree with the idea of transubstantiation. Rather, he suggested that God was really present in the bread, but it was still bread. God's presence was spiritual, and he used the analogy of a red-hot piece of iron. It's still iron, but heat is present. This idea is called consubstantiation, if you want a long word for it. Luther also wrote books and, importantly, hymns, so everyone could sing and take to heart the new theology. The other thing Luther did was to marry a nun, Catherine von Bora, in 1525, and so to make it clear that he did not believe that priests had to be celibate. It may have started as a symbolic marriage, but it seems to have become one of love and support. So, to summarise, the three great emphases of Luther and the Reformers were: 1. The supreme authority of Scripture. Popes and councils can and have erred. So what they teach, if it cannot be reasoned from Scripture, is not something that has to be believed. Luther was indifferent to other matters of liturgy, and he eased the transition by keeping the form of worship similar. As you'll find out, other reformers sought a simpler style of worship, but 1. The authority of Scripture. 2. Salvation by grace, a gift of God, received by faith alone. And 3. The priesthood of all believers. There's no need for a priest to be an intermediary between the individual and God. All are called to a vocation, and that of a farmer or a soldier is as important as that of a pastor or scholar. Just to pause and ask yourself the question, how do you understand communion and God's presence in it? And also, how do you understand that you've been put right with God? When we come back together, we'll go into small groups to discuss those two issues.